My name is Jonathan Fung. I'm a faculty member in the School of Physical Sciences. And on behalf of the organizing committee, the Office of the Chancellor, the Campus Climate Council, who will all sponsor this event, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 7th season of What Matters to Me and Why at UCI. All right. So this season, we're very happy to have Dean Song Richardson, who will be our first speaker. I'm really happy to have her, not just because she's such a well-known member of the UCI community, but also because I was one of her college classmates. So it's really interesting to see, whether she's done anything with her life since then. Okay, so in a few minutes, I'll invite Professor Jane Page from the School of the Arts to actually give a proper introduction. But before that, since this is the first one of the season, let me just say a little bit about what matters to me and why. How many of you have not been to What Matters to Me and Why talk before? Okay, great. So a number of you. So let me tell you what you've sort of wandered into. So this series was, as I say, founded about 7 years ago. It's meant to be a forum for faculty and staff to tell us basically what matters to them and why. Speakers are not given any other guidance or restrictions other than to answer that question in whatever way they see fit. And speakers have, through the years, taken all sorts of interesting ways to answer that question, many of them describing their lives, their triumphs, their failures, all sorts of fascinating things that don't normally come out. There's a lot of things to say, but let me just say maybe two things. If you really want to know what this series is about, I invite you to do the following exercise, which is, while Dean Richardson is speaking, or maybe shortly after, pretend someone just invited you to give this talk, and you had 30 minutes to tell an audience on videotape what matters to you and why. It's a very interesting exercise. And if it's too hard for you, pretend a friend is going to do it and wonder for yourself, what would they have said? And if you don't know, maybe you want to ask them. So as I say, this is the 7th season. That means we have about 40 videos of previous talks online. I'd really invite you to go look at them. They're fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Here, our next talk, usually we have one a month, so the next one normally would be in November. This year, it's a little bit different. We're having ours on October 31st, the next talk. So that's, of course, not so hard to remember. Come in your costume. Whoever has the best costume gets like some big prize, extra bag of chips or something like that. I don't know. But that will be Professor Ann Lemnitzer from the School of Engineering, who will, of course, also give a fascinating talk. So I invite you to look for that. Registration for that should be open like in a few hours or something, so you might want to do that. Things fill up quickly. This series, let me just let you know, has also spawned other series because of its interest here. We have an alumni series, so especially for students in the audience. If you are interested in seeing, what your life might look like 20 years from now, we have distinguished alumni who come back and basically explain what matters to them and why. The next one is November 1st, and so you can also look for that. It's a wonderful thing, and not only you don't get lunch, but you get dinner, so it's even better. And also this year, we're starting a medical school series. So those of you in the medical school, there will be a talk up in Orange in a month or so. Okay, some bookkeeping announcements. Please keep the room clean. We do really like this room, and so please clean up your lunch after you leave. You've all been given questionnaires, so I hope you will fill them out. We look at every single one of them as a committee very carefully, and especially the nominations for future speakers for the coming year, which we plan pretty soon, actually, so it's well in advance. And last, as you note, there's videotape there, and so if you don't want to be in the video, in the next 2 minutes, I will give you an opportunity to get out of the front row and switch seats with someone in the back row who doesn't mind. Okay. All right, so as is our tradition, we have people here from all schools on campus. We have faculty, staff, students. So we'd like to let you have a chance to get to know who you're sitting next to. So please take 60 seconds, and introduce yourself to your neighbor. And then Professor Page will come up.
Beautiful. Thank you. What a lively group. Hooray. My name is Jane Page, and I'm a professor in the drama department, and I serve on the What Matters to Me and Why committee, and it is a real joy to be on this committee. Thank you again for joining us today as we launch our season 2018-2019, and we are thrilled to be opening this series with one of the most remarkable people on our campus. It's my honor and my pleasure to introduce Dean Song Richardson. I first learned about her a couple years ago from a colleague of hers who is a friend of mine. I was amazed to hear that this remarkable woman, who is not only an internationally respected attorney, a distinguished scholar and professor, and is also a world-class award-winning classical pianist, including playing with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Quite a unique combination. Dean Richardson joined UCI's law school faculty I have in 2014. She served as a senior associate dean for academic affairs from 2016 to 17 and interim dean through December of 2017. And Dean Richardson earned her law degree from Yale Law School and an AB in psychology at Harvard University. She's been extensively published and has served on faculty advisor committees on the Center of Law, Equality, and Race, and is also a faculty affiliate at the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. She has a joint appointment in criminology and Asian American studies, and she studied music also at the Juilliard School, as well as at Harvard. In January 2018, she became the dean of the UCI Law School, becoming the only woman of color to serve in this role among U.S. News and World Report's top 30 law schools in the country. In preparing for this event, Professor Jonathan Feng and I had the pleasure to meet with Song last spring, and we had a wonderful conversation about her life, and we discussed her family, her upbringing, her endless hours of piano practice, and her journey to her remarkable passions and career. I went away from this conversation touched and inspired. She is a remarkable woman, not just inspired by her unbelievable skills and passions and determination, but I am profoundly moved by her warmth, her openness, and her generosity. She carries herself with joy, optimism, and determination, all qualities that inspire me, and I know she will inspire you too. Song Richardson.
Wow. I'm looking for one thing, 1 second, and then I will start. But I don't. So who would have thought that I would need to have notes to talk to all of you about what matters to me and why. I can't believe that all of you are here. I was hoping that maybe it would be an intimate group of my husband and a few others. And I'll disclose to you at the beginning just how stressful this is. I give talks all the time about my area of research, and I talk to audiences all the time, but somehow this idea of having to speak to all of you about what matters to me and actually spending the time to think about what matters to me and why was incredibly difficult, but I'm so happy now that I was forced to really be introspective and to do this. So I thought that I would start with a story. So I grew up on Army bases. My father was an officer in the Army. I was an Army brat. My mother was a Korean immigrant. And we traveled quite a bit, as people who grew up in the military do, to different Army bases across the country. But they never, not once, when I was growing up, did my parents ever talk to me about the impact of their race and ethnicity on their lives. And they shielded me and my two younger brothers from any discussion of that. And so I grew up on Army bases where my best friend was Black and Korean like me, where there were so many mixes of children that it never even occurred to me to think about my background as being something unusual. Never did anyone ask me, "What are you? Where are you from? No, where are you really from? No. What race are you?" is what they really wanted to know, as I'll talk about in a moment when I arrived at college. But prior to that, I never had to answer that question or think at all about the impact of race on me and on my family. So what I thought that I would do today is share a little bit about my journey in becoming quote unquote raced, growing up in college and beyond, because that really is what motivates me. And it is what has motivated everything that I've done in my life since college. So I'll start with my childhood. So what you are seeing here is my father's family. You can see him in his military uniform. And as I started to understand the impact of race, I started looking through my father's old photos. And you can see two of them on the top of this screen. And what really impacted me and what makes me so sad that I never had deep conversations with him about his experiences growing up in the 40s and the 50s. I never had the opportunity to talk to him about what it was like to often be the only Black man. There are literally hundreds of photos like this where he is the only African American officer. And then on the bottom you see photos of my mother and my father. And so my mom, although my father was an officer and a colonel in the Army, my mom ruled our family with an iron fist. I'm still scared to my mom to this day. And what she did, she really had a dream for me and my two younger brothers. And her dream, because she was an immigrant here, and the school that she had heard of when she was growing up in Korea was Harvard. So her dream was that I become a concert pianist, that my two younger brothers become musicians, and then that we all go to Ivy League schools. And so she achieved her dream because my younger brother, who now lives in Australia, went to MIT. And then the youngest of my brothers, who now lives in Florida, he also went to Harvard and then went to Harvard Medical School. So the three of us achieved that part of the dream, but this was her other dream, which is that we would all play an instrument. So by the time I was 3.5 to 4 years old, my mother would literally sit next to me. That's what she did. She literally sat next to me when I was at the piano, and she would force me, because I didn't want to do it, right? I wanted to go outside, I wanted to play, I wanted to have friends, I wanted to go to parties like everyone else did. But all the way through high school, and in high school, for 4 to 6 hours on school nights, and then 8 to 10 hours on weekends, I was forced to practice. And I hated it. And so I think it's why, as I'll talk about in a moment, when I became a criminal defense lawyer, a job that I loved, I really understood what freedom meant. I really did. Because there was one day every year, and I still remember this feeling, that feeling of freedom that I would have, because there was one day every year where I could go outside and not practice. And that was the day before school started again. And that feeling of freedom, I still remember it, walking outside, lying in the grass, not having to practice. I still feel that feeling. And so and it's not the same, obviously, as being in jail like my clients were, but it felt like that, right? When I would go through my diaries, that's what it would say. I feel like I'm in jail. But what's interesting about it is that my mom, after I graduated from law school, after my father passed away, said to me, "I'm so sorry." I'm going to get emotional. And I promised myself I wouldn't. But she said, "I'm so sorry that I made you do that." And I said to her, "Please don't be sorry. It's because you did this for me and my two brothers that we've been able to do the things in life that we've done. It's because you've done this that I got to travel all across the world, playing with orchestras in Europe, in Asia, all across the US. It was because of her. And it's because of her that my brothers and I formed a trio, and we used to also play with orchestras and travel across the country playing together. And the thing that makes me the most sad about the trio is that now we're all spread across the country. One brother lives in Australia, right? I live here, the other in Florida, and so we haven't had an opportunity to play together again. But I credit my parents, both of them, for the opportunities that they gave to us. They told us that we could do anything we wanted to do as long as we never gave up and worked hard. And for my mom, the most important thing to her, for me, a daughter, is that I would never, ever in my life be dependent on anyone else, whether it's my husband, a boyfriend, or anything else. She always wanted me to have the freedom to be alone and be happy. And that was her dream, and she achieved it. And I should mention, by the way, that I didn't come from a wealthy background at all. Like I mentioned, my dad was an officer in the military, and my mom, because piano lessons, cello lessons, and violin lessons are incredibly expensive. And so she would hate it that I'm about to share what I'm about to share about her, but it makes me so proud, and I don't think she should be embarrassed about this at all. Because she had to sit next to me to force me to practice, and because we needed the extra income, she worked the night shift in a factory, in a rope factory. That's what she did every night. I still remember her leaving every night, coming home very early in the morning when I went off to school. And then after she left the rope factory, she cleaned houses around the area where I grew up throughout my entire high school, my time in high school. That's what she did. While my father went off to work in the military and then worked for the Department of Revenue. They sacrificed everything for their children, and it means so much to me, especially as I get older and I realize those sacrifices, and I think about that all the time. Okay, so then I went to college, and as mentioned before, I went to Harvard. And in my first year at Harvard, they had a concerto competition, and I knew that I wasn't going to continue practicing and playing the piano. I so regret it now, because the one thing my mom said is, no matter what, just play an hour every day, and then you'll remember how to play. And I didn't. And now I love playing the piano, but it takes me a while to do anything close to what I used to be able to do. But as was mentioned, I also got into Juilliard, and I decided I did not want to follow the music route, and so I went to Harvard instead. I did the concerto competition my first year as a freshman. I was lucky enough to win that, and I think Jonathan was in the orchestra, right, when I performed with the Harvard Radcliffe Orchestra, and then that was the last time I performed like that. I completely gave it up and threw myself into college. And by throwing myself into college, what I mean is, as many of you have probably felt before, I felt like a complete imposter. and I was exposed to people who had lives so different from me. Like, I remember being shocked when the people who lived across the hall from me, she walked out of her dorm room with a guy. Like, what? Right? People would drink, they would party, and I would say to people, you don't have to drink to have fun. Right? Like, I didn't drink, I didn't know how to party. I was so unbelievably shy. And to this day, I am still a complete introvert. Like, this is one of the most stressful things I have ever done in my life. It really takes a lot of energy, but I was incredibly shy, never spoke in class, would never raise my hand. When I had to give a report at school, I would have my notes, and then I wouldn't be able to read it, and it would be just like this, and then my voice would shake like this, and then I would sound like I was about to cry. Like, that is what college was for me. And I felt like I was an imposter, like I didn't belong, that everyone was going to figure out pretty soon that I was a complete fraud. And so throughout it got a little bit better when I got into my junior and my senior year. I got a little bit better, but there were a couple of things that happened while I was in college that really formed what matters to me. So I told you it started in college when people started coming up to me and asking me where I was from. And I really took it literally when they said that. So I would say, just outside of Boston. And then the questions would continue and continue until I realized that they had a need to put me in a box, to categorize me in order to figure out something about me. Fast forward to today, I now realize, because I speak a lot about unconscious gender and unconscious racial biases, and I realize it is a human need. We are all categorizing each other all the time, because it's just how our brains work. But for me, having that happen in college was incredibly alienating, especially when I realized that they wanted to know about my race, and it was then that I started thinking about growing up with my parents, and a lot of things began to mean something different to me. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. It used to annoy me so much when I needed to get to the airport, and I'd get into the car with my father, and he would follow the speed limit. Right? We were late, but he wouldn't go a single mile, right, over the speed limit. And my brothers and I would be yelling at him, asking him to go faster. We were going to miss our plane. I now realize why. He was a black man driving down the highways of Massachusetts. And Boston is one of the most racist cities that exist. And I understood why he drove the speed limit. I also understood when we drove cross country as children, my parents, my two younger brothers and I driving cross country, why we always brought our food with us, why we never stopped at any restaurant or anything like that on the drive. I now realize as an interracial couple, they just didn't want to risk it. And so my students, when they read this and a profile of me, said, "Don't say this, Professor, but I'm going to share it with you because it's such a formative part of my thoughts of my childhood." And that was the coffee can that we used to bring with us in the car so that we could use the coffee can instead of going to a restroom. And I thought everyone did that. I thought we were just being efficient, right? I didn't realize. I didn't realize why we had that coffee can with us, but now I do. And sometimes my husband Kurt is here, and we often drive and travel together, and he's white if you can't see him, right? And so, but the reason I mention that is even to this day, when we will drive to places that aren't a big city, and he'd want to stop to a little restaurant over here, a little bar over there, I am always, still to this day, concerned about walking in to a strange place, especially as a black woman, as a black Asian woman, with a white husband. And so it's been interesting for us to start thinking about this. So anyway, in college, I went to this place called the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination to do an internship. Because as I started to think about race, I really wanted to know, does race make a difference? Because in my view, it didn't, right? My whole life growing up, people were always mixed. I didn't think about race. And so in college, I started to think about it. I saw on a bulletin board, because that's how old I am, right? Not online, on a bulletin board, people asking for this internship, interns to work at the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And so I began working there. And they had testers at MCAD, where you would go and try to rent an apartment. And so we'd have the identical application. I'd go try to rent an apartment. My white colleague would go rent an apartment, and I would come back and I'd say, oh, nothing's happened here. They just rented that apartment already. It's what I really thought, right? And then the white colleague would go to the identical person who was so nice to me when she told me that there were no more apartments available, and she, my white colleague, would get the apartment. And so once again, I started thinking about the way that race matters, even if, as a person of color, you don't realize that it does, because I had no idea. And this began then, again, my interest in thinking a lot about race, thinking a lot about gender, but also thinking about attributional ambiguity, which is something I talk about and talk to Kurt a lot about. By attributional ambiguity, if you are a minority, whatever type of minority you might be, and you are concerned that someone might be treating you differently because of who you happen to be, that's attributional ambiguity. If someone, happens constantly, even now. If I go out with my vice dean, Bryant Garth, who's an older white male, used to be a dean at a different law school. If we go out together and people completely ignore me and talk to him because he looks like a dean, or is that why they're talking to him? Maybe they just like him better, right? Maybe that's why. Maybe they feel more comfortable around him because he's a male like they are. But this is attributional ambiguity. I don't know why this is happening. And so part of me is thinking it's because of my gender and because of my race, and part of me is thinking, maybe not. And for so many of us who might be the only one, or whoever we are in a particular environment or instance, you know what that feels like, right? Someone is a jerk and you wonder, are they a jerk to me because of who I am, or are they just a jerk? Right? Attributional ambiguity is part of my life, and it really started when I started to become aware of race, especially at the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. So that's when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer, like the civil rights lawyers who worked at the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, and that's why I went to law school. I was going to become a civil rights lawyer. And so when I got to law school, these are some photos from law school and some of the things that I did. So on the upper left-hand side is my former dean at the very top with my parents. And then there's Harold Coe, who I'll talk about in a moment, and Stephen Bright. Two people who influenced my time at law school. Because at law school, as I mentioned, the only purpose of going to law school was to become a civil rights lawyer. I took a clinic, an immigration clinic, and then I was lucky enough to work. What? Uh-oh, on what?
No, we're trying to get a cord.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, great, thank you. Doesn't matter if it goes out. Okay, but it's not on here. Hold on.
I think it just went to sleep. It just went to sleep.
That's all right.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. It's no worries. How do I get it up again? Is this how? It doesn't matter. I'll keep talking. So what I ended up doing is I was lucky enough to be in a clinic with Harold Coe. And at the time was when the Haitian refugee crisis was happening. And we were lucky enough, a group of us as students at Yale, we were lucky enough to represent all of the Haitian refugees who came to our shores and then were brought to Guantanamo Bay. We actually went to Guantanamo Bay as students to interview some of the refugees and the children who were there. And as a result of doing that and taking the immigration clinic, I decided I wanted to become an immigration lawyer. And also think about the international implications of immigration, race, and ethnicity. So the other thing I was able to do when I was in law school was my first summer I spent working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in DC, and the second half in South Africa. This would have been in now I'm going to tell you how old I am. This would have been in 1991. And that's okay. And what was incredible about being in South Africa at the time were all the changes that were happening with the apartheid system. I was able to go into townships and study at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. It was an incredible experience. And one of the things that I recall the most about that, though, was coming back. And the reason for that, and this ties back again to race, is because when I was in South Africa, I was, quote unquote, colored. I wasn't black, I wasn't white, I was in this group called colored. And that was the first time, both before and since, the first time in my life where I was completely, totally accepted for who I was. And I know that sounds bizarre to say about South Africa at the time, but my group was the colored group. And there was never any question about who I was and how I was going to be treated or anything like that. And I didn't even realize that level of comfort one feels until I came back and didn't have it again. And it started to, and even now when I think about it, right, because to go back to college for a moment, when I was in college, the Black Law Students Association, not law students, the Black Students Association had a meeting about me and another colleague, another friend of mine who was black and white, about why we didn't think that we were black. And it wasn't that I didn't think that I was black. As I mentioned to you, I didn't think about race at all at the beginning of college, but that was alienating for me. And then the Korean Students Association, and I grew up very Korean, right? My mom, like I told you, ruled with an iron fist. I feel Korean too. I feel both black and Korean. But the Korean Students Association didn't accept me either. Didn't even recognize that I was Korean. And so for a lot of my life, this has been who I am. And so when I went to South Africa, I didn't even have to think about it, because I fit in completely. And that feeling is something that maybe many of you just experience without even realizing that you experience it. But it is an incredible feeling to have. Okay, so I graduated from law school, and I got something called the Skadden Public Interest Fellowship. They give 25 of those out every year, and they fund, Skadden is a law firm, and they fund you to go work in a public interest organization. So by my third year, I knew what I was going to do. I was working at the National Immigration Law Center in LA and splitting the other half of my time at the immigration unit of the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn. So I was all set. So my last semester, I took a class with Stephen Bright, who's a gentleman on the right. He runs a place called the Southern Center for Human Rights, and it was a class called Race and the Death Penalty. And I had no interest in the death penalty. I clerked for a prosecutor's office in my first year of law school and then realized, not for me, can't do it. But it never occurred to me to do criminal defense. Like, who would want to do that and represent those evil people? Never occurred to me that I would want to become a criminal defense lawyer, but I saw that class and the description about race and the death penalty. I thought, I have to take this class. And so I did. And it changed the course of the rest of my career. Because I wanted to become a civil rights lawyer, and there is no place, in my view, where the civil rights battle is being fought, ground zero, is our criminal justice system. And so I went and did my scadden for 2 years, but immediately after that, I started to do criminal defense work. So I started my criminal defense work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund doing death penalty habeas appeals. And that postcard that you see up there is one that we would give out at LDF, at the Capital Punishment Unit. It was a postcard made from a drawing in a case where a black man was sentenced to death by a jury who was playing hangman. And that is the actual note from the jury, or the drawing, from the jury who sentenced him to die. So I always carried, I used to have a big poster that I would put up in my office of that same thing. I just can't find it now, otherwise it would be up there, but I have the postcard. But my students used to walk into my office and be like, what? Why? So I did that at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I also represented Kemba Smith at the time. Some of you may know her. She was sentenced to a life sentence because she was carrying drugs for her abusive drug dealing boyfriend. At the time, she is now free. After working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I moved to Seattle, became a federal public defender, and then a state public defender, and then into private practice. Many people think that that's the backwards way to do it, right? You're supposed to start at the state, then go to the feds, then go to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, but I did it backwards, and each move is because I wanted to learn more about the way that the criminal justice system worked. And being a public defender was the best job I have ever had, except for the one that I have now as a law professor. And some of you, I just put it up there because some of you always mention this to me. So there was a 48 hours episode done on the last case, the last major case, 3 counts of aggravated murder in Seattle. 48 Hours did a special on the show, and then the confession tapes apparently on Netflix shows that trial. So I loved being a trial lawyer. I loved being a public defender, and a criminal defense lawyer. But then I got an opportunity again to change my career, and that happened when one of my colleagues, a criminal defense lawyer who we used to do trainings across the country for baby criminal defense lawyers, she taught at DePaul University College of Law. In fact, this is how Erwin Chemerinsky, the first dean of UCI Law, and I bonded because he also started his career at DePaul University College of Law. So that was my first job because she called me up to say they were looking for someone to teach criminal procedure, and I thought, I am burnt out from the 2-year-long trial that I just talked about, the 3 counts of aggravated murder. I needed a break, and I knew I needed a break because of the final case I had, which was a quote-unquote terrorism case. And it wasn't a terrorism case, but that's what the US Attorney's Office called it. And I remember, and it was an attorney from Canada who was being prosecuted, and I'm gonna skip all the way to the sentencing hearing. And this is how I knew I needed a break. Because he was being sentenced for a crime that I didn't think he had committed and wasn't a crime in my view at all. And I felt so angry in exactly the way that I felt working at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is why I left doing death penalty work, because I was getting so angry and so bitter. I used to walk down the street thinking, how can you smile when these horrible things are going on? And I felt that way after going to Guantanamo. I felt that way coming back from South Africa, right? It's that feeling of how can you smile and live in this world when these horrible things are happening? That's how I felt. So when I was sitting in that courtroom, standing next to my client as he was being sentenced, I could feel my eyes welling up. And I thought, Song, you cannot cry in a federal courtroom, right? You can't cry. And I'm sitting there, my eyes welled up, and then the tears just started to fall. And I thought, I need a break. Because I was so disgusted and angry at what our country was doing. So I got the call, and I went to DePaul and started teaching criminal procedure and loved it, right? Like, what's so great to teach students who are so excited and happy to hear what it is that you have to say, and you can impart, right, your wisdom to the extent you have it, your opinions, I should say, and I always let them know it's my opinion. So that's how I started teaching. That's how I got into teaching. I got my foot in the door by visiting one semester. I got a job there. Then I moved to a couple of other schools and ended up at Washington, at American University, and then Iowa, which I loved. We would have stayed there for the rest of our lives, and I never thought I would have been proud to be someone from Iowa, but I loved it. I went from lying to people when they would ask me where I was from. I'd say outside of Chicago, to being proud, right, to have lived in Iowa City, and the only place I would have left Iowa City to join was UCI. Because I knew what UCI Law was doing. Everything about UCI Law was what I was about, right? What I cared about, interdisciplinary research, public service, a commitment to public service and social justice. Like, what other school, who wouldn't want to come to UCI? So when I got that phone call, I couldn't believe it. I jumped at the chance, and then I ended up here. And to end, I'll say, I never in a million years would have imagined that I would become the dean of this unbelievable law school. And one of my RAs said this to me. She's now a graduate, Ariella Rutkenbecker. When I took the job as dean, she said, because she had asked me when we thought that Irwin was leaving, Irwin kept saying to me, Song, you should think about being our next dean. And I said, hell would freeze over my dead body. This will never happen. And so exactly. And then somehow here I am. And so my RA said to me, Song, I thought you weren't going to take that job. And then she said, but as I started to think about it, everything that you told me about all the jobs that you've had have started out in exactly the same way. And I wouldn't have realized it until she said it to me. I never would have thought I would be a litigator because, as I said, I couldn't speak in public. Scared to death. Never would have thought I would become a capital defense lawyer. Never. If you would ask me, what Song were you, because so many of my classmates wanted to be a law professor. When they would ask me about that, I would laugh and say exactly the same thing I said about becoming dean. No way, hilarious. Me, a law professor, like funny. And then I became a law professor. And now, right, dean, same thing, right? And I realized through my RA that a lot of the things that I've experienced in my life are because opportunities were presented to me. And though I said no at the beginning, I eventually decided, why not? Let me take the risk. I'm used to failure. I mean, becoming a concert pianist, you know that when you're up there and your memory goes blank, you can't stop, right? The orchestra's still playing. You can't just sit there and stop. You got to keep going. And so I learned that at a very young age. You've got to fail in order to succeed. You can't be afraid of that failure. And that is part of what matters to me, is letting my students know that I feel what you feel. Your fear of speaking, your feeling that you're an imposter, you feeling like you don't belong here and everyone is going to find out in a second, I felt and still feel. So part of what matters to me is teaching my students to not be afraid of failure, to take risks. When people say you can't do something, believe you can. And there was this great TED Talk, many of you have probably seen it, the fake it till you make it TED Talk. And I know that some have debunked that science, but you know what? I don't care. Because that's what you do, right? You fake it until you actually make it. That's what I do. I fake it until I make it, and they can do it too. So that's part of what motivates me. And the second that motivates me is talking to people about race. And it's part of why I focus on unconscious racial and gender biases, because of my whole journey thinking about race and thinking about gender. And so part of my goal is to make this world a better place, to leave it better. And I know it sounds so trite to say it, but I really believe that. Making the world a better place than how it is right now is part of what motivates me. And being lucky enough to be a dean of such an incredible law school where I can try to impact the lives of our students. And when I have such incredible people, some of whom are here, the rest are on break, thank goodness, right? That I have such an incredible team to work with, and we just are building an incredible place together for our students. So that's what motivates me. This is why. Can't believe you're all here to hear this, but thank you so much for coming. Go, sit. Sorry, I forgot the most important slide. This, my family, my husband. Oh my gosh. This is the most important slide right here, so yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dean Richardson. Fantastic talk. We do have some time for questions, though, so please raise your hand, and microphones will come around so that we can make sure we get your question on the videotape.
I see someone back there.
Dean, thank you so much for being here. I actually would love to divert my question and ask more about the slide here so you can share a little bit about your family and why they matter to you and why.
Just very quickly, I can't believe this is like the most important. So you see our kids, our dog and our two cats. One of our cats had brain surgery recently, but now she's alive. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here right now. And then it's my brother and his two children. And then up on top are my brother, my mother, and my sisters-in-law. And then my husband. And then just closer pictures of my family in Australia on the bottom right-hand side. And then just close-ups of my brother and his family and their children. And I really I couldn't do any of this without my husband, Kurt, whose whole career has been spent picking up and traveling to different places every few years for me. Thank you. Hi, Beth.
Hi, Sam. Well, you talked a lot about the racial issues more than the gender issues.
Yep.
But there's a wonderful story in your brain about a time when you had an interaction with a federal judge. And I don't know whether his comment to you was something about race or something about gender, but I think you should tell that story as your friend.
Thank you, Beth. Yes. So I'll just tell the story very quickly. So the chief judge, he might still be the chief judge, is he? In Seattle Federal Court. I had a trial in front of him with my partner, my law partner, one of my law partners, Amanda Lee, a white woman. That's why I think it might have been about race versus gender, but it could be both. So she had curly hair like me, and she would wear her hair down, it was about this long, throughout the entire trial. Because I'm always concerned about how a juror or how a judge might view me and my hair, I would put my hair up. And black women in this audience understand like the drama of the hair, right? We're always trying to figure out, what do we do with our hair? Do we straighten it? Do we keep it out? What happens if it rains? Anyway, it's a whole thing. So because Seattle rains a lot, another reason, I put my hair up. So we get to the end of the trial, and in federal court, you can't speak to the jurors yourself like you can in state court. So we went up to the judge and we asked if there's any feedback from the jurors that we should know about. And he decided to share with me, not with Amanda, that what the jury said is that they found my hair distracting. Yeah, what does that mean exactly? I was so angered by that. It reminds me today of when you read teaching evaluations and you want to give feedback to a colleague of yours, you share the feedback that's helpful. And so I started thinking to myself, why did you share with me that the jury found my hair distracting? What am I supposed to do about that? Am I supposed to cut my hair off? There's nothing more I can do because it's already up? And by the way, I disliked this judge from the beginning because I knew, even before, right, because of his treatment of both of us, my co-counsel and I, and of our client. I mean, this was a judge who helped the prosecutor, right? When the prosecutor wasn't doing a good cross-examination, he would help. He would step in to help them. And that's not really unusual, right? When you think about the US attorney and a private criminal defense lawyer, they don't like us. So I already didn't like him. But after he shared, this is one of the things I talked to Beth Loftus about, because Beth is, you know Beth, but what you might not know about Beth is she's one of the best known experts on memory in Seattle, Washington, where I practice. She's known across the world, but that's how I knew her. And so the story I have to add to this is when I got accepted to teach here at UCI, there was a welcome party at Bob Solomon's house, and Kurt and I were walking to Bob's house. We couldn't quite find it, and I see this woman walking down the street with this hat. And then I thought I recognized her, and then she introduced herself to me as Beth Loftus, and I almost died, right? Because I just admired her so much because I knew who she was, and have her be the first person I met and have her be as incredibly welcoming and warm as she was an incredible welcome to this community. But that's the story Please feel free to send it to that judge whose name I won't mention.
One last one, if you have the time.
Okay, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk. It was very touching, and I think the topic of race really caught my attention. Being an Asian woman, still feel so. I really enjoyed talk. My question is somewhat different. Actually, I'm teaching law of economics this quarter, and you mentioned that in the UCI Law School, you really encourage interdisciplinary research.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, what's your view? Like, I find this class really challenging.
Yes.
And so what do you think is the impact of economics on the law and the impact of law on economics? And what do you think is the most important message you should get through to my students about studying the law of economics?
What a great question. So there's a whole theory within the legal academy called law and economics. And it's one of these theories of the law that I think, so I'll go back. Economics typically talks about the reasonable, the rational human. And they make all of these assumptions about how the rational man, I said on purpose, would act. There's this whole new area of research called behavioral law and economics. I don't know if they mentioned that, right? Which take a more realistic view about how humans aren't actually rational all the time. And I love behavioral law and economics, and Kahneman and Tversky. I don't know if you're reading them. I love that area of the law, and it's very much related to the social science that I rely on in my implicit gender and racial bias work. But I think that law and economics has had an enormous impact on law, on judges, on the way judges think, on the way many academics have thought. It just took over the legal academy in a way. And I think that that's changing, that hold that it had on the legal academy, but I do think it continues to impact the way that some judges think about the law and the way that some scholars think about the law. And it impacts the law to me in a way that I personally don't agree with. Because I don't agree, I don't believe in the rational man, right? Or woman, but it's typically man. But it does have a huge impact, but I think that stronghold that it has on the academy and on legal doctrine is changing.
Thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't take more questions, but. So we're all doing this already, but let me just formally thank you, Song, for such a wonderful kickoff talk. And let's thank Dean Richardson again.
Thank you so much for coming.